the summer of 1974, a relay on a ridge in the Appalachians simply went dead. No one could reach the little outpost. The base that picked up the blackout sent word down the chain. A routine signal failure. Check for wiring, weather, maybe a fallen pole. They sent us to make sure. I remember the way they said it. Flat, clipped, like it was nothing more than a blown fuse. I remember thinking for a moment that it would be exactly that. A fuse, a busted antenna, a late-night patch job, and we'd be gone by dawn. If you like deep military mysteries and first-hand accounts, subscribe. This is one I never expected to tell. I was Staff Sergeant Ethan Ramirez then, 28, 29 by the clocks I stopped trusting. I ran comms for a small unit assigned to rapid response in the region. No parades, no press, just maintenance, security, and when things went poorly, cleanup. Miguel Torres was my radio tech. His hands could get an oscilloscope to sing even when the world wanted static. Javier Luna ran security, lean, taciturn, a man who walked like he expected trouble but preferred to avoid it. David Ortega drove, steady hands behind an old deuce and half, the kind of truck that smelled like oil and old maps and didn't care if you cursed at it. We had no name for our unit beyond a dusty memo and a P.O. box. We answered to orders and the patch on our sleeves. The order to move came on a crisp paper chit stamped urgent, the kind you learn to look at and pretend not to notice the way it tightens your stomach. Coordinates, the grid that sat 3 ridge lines in from the main road, the words assess and report anomalies, and a notice that the site was under separate administrative control, meaning someone else owned the keys, and we were only supposed to look. No photographs, no deviation from protocol. Keep it contained, keep it quiet. We left at dusk. The road wound like an old serpent up through pine and oak. Fog clung to the wheel wells. Our radios, ANPRC-25s for the men on the truck and a vehicle-mounted set wired into the main harness, sounded like summer. Snaps of static, the odd cicada fret in the background. Miguel kept one ear to the handset, thumb moving over the mic as if he could butter the signal with touch. We talked in the economy of soldiers on a narrow mission. Names, gear checks, reminders about badges and masks. Someone joked, I don't remember who, about ghosts and backwoods legends. No one laughed long. The facility top looked older than the base map suggested. Concrete poured into the ridge like someone trying to hide a secret with brute force. Barbed wire crowned a perimeter fence that had started to rust at the fasteners. A single guard hut sat to the right of a gate that had no signage in the light, only numbers painted and then painted over, layers of bureaucracy hiding other layers. A pair of civilian sedans were parked crooked near the lot. One of them had a government seal that hadn't seen the sun in a while.
Colonel Hayes met us at the gate. He was not a colonel I knew. He wore the rank with a kind of weary thrift, like a man who had learned that authority meant less than a good explanation. He introduced himself with a clipped phrase, "You are the comms team." His voice had no up, only a practiced flatness. He had a clipboard, a pocket watch on a chain, and a glance that measured whether you would be useful. He informed us, politely, that we would remain with the party inside, that all movements would be supervised, and that photography and personal recordings were strictly forbidden. We signed forms. We were administered a quick briefing that felt like someone reading a script without inflection. The briefing said, telemetry blackout, unknown cause. Investigations conducted by on-site civilian researchers. Our orders were to verify site integrity and report anomalies. The colonel's eyes held nothing but procedure. The entrance sat low to the earth. A concrete apron led to a thick access door, the kind that spins on axes like the lid of a buried box. It smelled of oil and the wind from the ridge, but beneath that was a sterile note. Chlorine, antiseptic, something the lungs recognize as sterile, even when what is sterile ought to be safer. We passed through a narrow checkpoint where personnel badges were checked against logbooks that had been scrawled in more than one hand. The ones who worked below wore plain clothes with lab coats thrown over them. Not the white coats of friendly small-town doctors, but the gray wash of scientific workers who had learned to live on coffee and fluorescent light. Before we went down, we were decontaminated. It was an old ritual, simple and humiliating. A spritz of a clear solution at the joints of the jacket, a quick wipe with a rag that smelled of lemon cleansing fluid, the cursory instruction to keep your mouths closed in case something went airborne. They clipped a dosimeter badge to my chest, a small disc that did not look life-threatening until you realized it didn't beep at all and had to be read by hand. Miguel checked his equipment twice, muttering under his breath about calibration. Javier kept his Colt 1911 at his hip, the metal pressed like a fact against his leg. We took the elevator down. It was not the kind of slow, reassuring shaft that lowers you to the basement of a building. It had no mirrored walls.
The car smelled of oil and the faint sweetness of old insulation. The lights hummed, a low metallic prayer, and the gauge above the door moved past level 0, past level -1, past the numbers most facilities ever hide. The ride lengthened the way rides do when your thoughts make the air heavy. The first level below was administrative, offices with typewriters, a supply room with boxes stamped with dates in the late 1960s, coffee cups that had been ashtrays at some point. Men and women in shirt sleeves moved as if they'd been doing this for years.
They greeted us in a way that welcomed our usefulness but not our curiosity. Dr. Samuel Moreno met us there. Short, a man whose frame suggested years of being bent over instruments rather than over children or books. He shook my hand and said, with an expression like a man reluctantly giving a lecture he did not want to, "We appreciate the assist," he said. He smelled like tobacco and antiseptic. "What's the issue?" I asked, because it was my job to ask. Moreno's answer was a slow circle of words. Telemetry dropped from the ridge relay at 0300. The on-site monitor showed a sudden oscillation, then a blackout. We lost feed on several internal sensors. Then the environmental system experienced an overload. Power tripped to sublevels. We patched the external grid, but internal synchronization is compromised. It sounded like a translation of something complex into the shape of a sentence I could swallow. Translation is often how they ask soldiers to accept a world already made for them. Deeper still were stairs that smelled of metal, the kind where your boots echo and your breath sounds like an intruder. The lights in the stairwell were arrayed at regular intervals, but when we reached the lower descent, we left that uniformity for a corridor that had been cut from the rock. The designers had tried to make it look like utility by encasing the concrete in bare metal, but the metal could not entirely hide the sense that the hill itself had been hollowed out for reasons larger than storage. The walls had cuts for cables, thick bundles of insulated wire like veins. In certain places, condensation had collected and left dark streaks. Below a drip, the paint was pitted. We reached a point where labeled doors gave way to a panel that bore no identification. Dr. Alan Cortez appeared there, the facility director, slightly taller than Moreno, eyes that measured instruments for the world they couldn't fully explain. He carried a thick folder and the slow smile of someone who expected their explanations to be necessary. He told us nothing of the folder's contents, only that we would need to pass through a secondary decon and then proceed along the service corridor. The service corridor widened. It had the kind of institutional feeling that makes your collar itch. Stainless steel surfaces, recessed lighting that threw hard shadows, and frequent emergency hatches that could be sealed in an instant. Somewhere ahead, air moved in a way that suggested ventilation systems built to precise tolerances, huge fans whose slow spin was audible only as a low rumble, moving air like a giant's breath. They announced the presence of labs. On the walls hung schematic prints, maps of piping, diagrams of pressure gradients, lines crisscrossing that meant something to engineers and nothing to layfolk. And then we saw the tanks. They were behind reinforced glass, cylindrical, tall enough to stand inside on a good day, and filled with a slightly opalescent fluid that caught the light and made it difficult to judge depth. Frost had formed on the outside in irregular patterns, and the glass distanced what it contained into an image rather than a thing. Shadow, silhouette, something slow and mostly still. Electrodes clung to the outer rims of the tanks. Wires disappeared into sealed conduits. A thin film of algae, green under fluorescent light, grew in disjointed patches on the inner surfaces, as if the environment had found its own way to adapt. They had labeled them not as humans or animals, but as codes. Subject 1, Subject 3, Subject 7. The numbers did more than catalog. They created a pattern of bureaucracy around life. A clipboard lay on a nearby station, clipped with handwritten notes, temperature, pH, oxygenation rates. The instruments wore analog dials, needles that clenched like the lips of the room. Subject 3 was still. Through the distorted glass, I could see long limbs folded in on themselves, a head that felt too large for the body. The face had a geometry that made it resist description, elongated, with dark areas where eyes should be. Not an animal's mask, not a human's. Subject 3's chest rose with a regular surgical rhythm. There was a band across the torso with what looked like surgical sutures that had been there a while. Miguel leaned closer to a monitor and frowned. "No thermal bleed," he said. "No exponential biological signature. It's stable." Cortez gave us a guarded look. "These specimens are of unknown origin," he said, the sentence carefully chosen. "We are conducting research under special directive.
His tone implied the existence of a chain of command where ordinary curiosity had been quarantined by statute. Javier's jaw tightened. He had been quiet until then, listening to the lab's thin language. "Unknown origin," he said, slow, like a man asking for something fewer people ever give, the truth. "Unknown," Cortez said. "We classify them for safety reasons. Don't ask for more than you're authorized to know." What angered me then wasn't cynicism about secrecy. It was the smooth way the laboratory had made a place for a life they had not yet named. There is a terrible confidence in giving things a file instead of a name. We had been ordered to contain chaos. The lab had put the chaos into neat shoeboxes. A few of the scientists looked at us with the faint mixture of scientists who had spent too long without fresh air, gratitude for practical hands, but also a nagging impatience. Dr. Moreno, who had that look of a man tied to his instruments, gestured to a stack of papers. "We had telemetry drop, yes," he said. "The internal systems sometimes oscillate when external synchronization is lost. Pressure regulation can go as far out as several pascals in minutes with the kind of sub-level plumbing we use."
We have fail-safes, but the fail-safes are mechanical and can misalign. He put a hand on the glass near Subject 7's tank. Subject 7, unlike Subject 3, was not entirely inert. It lay pressed to the inner surface like a child at a window, but not with childish curiosity. The head tilted at an angle that made the dark patches where eyes might be form. The gesture, if one could call it a gesture, felt like the first time you notice that a thing can look back at you with intention. It looked at me. I remember the way my insides melted into a small, cold knot. The look lasted a pause long enough to make you count your own heartbeat. It was not animal. It was not simply reflex. The thing appeared to follow my face as I shifted. Its limbs, long and thin, flexed against the fluid. A faint pattern of movement traced its shoulders, as if it were rearranging itself to examine the glass, to press its face closer to the barrier between us. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the refrigeration systems humming somewhere beneath the floor. "You see," Dr. Moreno began, searching for the right language, "they respond to stimuli. They show behavioral adaptation. It's not what we expected." He looked at us as if he had said too much. On the drab counter under the glass there were other things that made the place more uncanny. Jars with labels in a careful hand, tissue samples preserved in formalin, fragments of tissue the color of dried blood, instruments with sterilized tags. There were notes on environmental control, oxygen fluctuation logs at 0200, a localized power sag at 0304, a brief surge at 0311. There were also schematic drawings, maps that detailed tunnels branching off beneath the facility, curving like roots. Some of the lines were overlaid with older ink that hinted at construction decades earlier. One drawing had annotations in a different hand, older still, as though the hill had been hollowed by different intentions over different generations. I picked up nothing relevant. All I had was curiosity, and the clipboard's weight felt heavy because it held the researchers' confidences that were not mine to know. The moral line between soldier and scientist is an odd thing. Soldiers enforce, scientists explain, and both make choices that later have consequences for other people's lives. We moved on. There were storage rooms with shelves of sealed canisters, each labeled with chemical formulas and dated in a way that suggested someone kept detailed logs out of compulsion rather than habit. There were centrifuges the size of a small engine, tubes spun with an evenness that looked like ritual. There were observation ports lined with benches where technicians might sit and watch. In the margins of a ledger I found a phrase underlined twice: behavioral indicators, intelligent response. The underlining suggested someone writing for emphasis because they needed other people to understand. It was here that the first alarm sounded. Not the shriek of a movie alarm, but something more restrained, a tone that began as a single note and then carried a human urgency as it repeated. The hum of the ventilation seemed to tighten. Lights shifted from steady white to an alerting red that washed the corridor like blood in slow motion. The dosimeter clipped at my chest felt suddenly absurdly light. Miguel swore under his breath and looked at his handset. The PRC-25 in his hand squealed with static, then found a carrier, a thin ribbon of signal. On the vehicle band, we heard a far-off voice sweep through, the base relay calling. The message was clipped and flat. Site telemetry nominal, except sub-levels report anomalous oscillation. We lost external sync, local power unstable. All non-essential observers to secure. Cortez saw it too. His face tightened into an expression I had seen only in men who discover their calculations might have been wrong. He barked instructions to a lab tech who darted toward a panel. I felt a human colliding with the machinery of a place built to deny the human. The doors that separated corridors clicked and sealed, and then clicked again as the building acknowledged the alarm.
We were shepherded into a compact briefing room where a map of the facility had been pinned to a board. On the map, a shaded area under the eastern wing was noted as non-standard. That non-standard shaded area had a ring of tunnels like a spider's web, and there, scrawled hurriedly in a hand that did not seem the scientist's neatness, someone had written the single word, pressure. The colonel's watch ticked. He looked at me and then at Miguel. "We need you to verify comms on the sublevels," he said to Miguel with the economy of someone who has never pretended to believe in luck. "We need to know if external links are reliable and whether we can patch them." Miguel tightened his jaw. He was small and wiry and used to making electronics do things they should not. "I can move with a Field 2 man," he said. "I want Javier and David outside in support and a skeleton crew inside for access. We won't need more than that." "What about containment?" Javier asked. He always asked the hard, practical question before anyone else had thought to. Cortez's hands folded. "Containment protocols are in place," he said, "but if the environmental system destabilizes, containment may be compromised. We may have to initiate emergency lockdown and transfer of critical specimens." The room suspended for a breath that might have been a thought. Someone mentioned explosives in a whisper, demolition charges, controlled collapse, like someone speaking a word that burns the edges of the conversation, but is also a tool in a toolbox of last resorts. The colonel did not flinch. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed hard choices and believed that the world would forgive him later if he saved the many by sacrificing the few. We moved back into the corridor. The alarms doubled in tempo.
Technicians ran like ants with sleeves rolled up, carrying clipboards and leads and cables. The air was charged with a mechanical panic, people trying to negotiate machines that had the stubborn inability to do what they once did automatically. We went back to the tanks. Subject 7's fluid clouded into a strange translucency. The needles on the meters ticked like tiny, urgent hearts. Miguel knelt by a station and put a hand to the glass, not touching, but shading. The creature shifted. This time it did not simply look. It reached, slowly, deliberately, its long fingers trailing in the fluid toward an internal gauge. There was a kind of attention in the movement that belonged to a being that recognized cause. The lab tech nearest to the bank of consoles shouted something about pH changes, took readings frenetically, and then his voice tightened into an executive readiness to perform a task he'd been taught in case the lab's assumptions broke. There was no time for explanation. The indicator lights on a central console flickered, and then a cascade of smaller panels chimed their own alarms. The main feed, the one that had been dead outside, tried to reassert itself like a throat clearing to speak. A technician swore and began typing on a terminal that had a tape drive humming beneath it, producing paper strips that newsprint the monitors in radio rooms used to make when something was really wrong. Then the lights dimmed further, and a different sound threaded through the alarm, the metallic twang of a pressure valve tearing at its mouth. There was a distant, wet-sounding snap that made everyone look toward the sealed doors leading to the service tunnel. For the first time since I'd seen Subject 7's face, we all moved like parts in a machine learning to work, but with an animal's urgency. "Lockdown," someone said. The word repeated down the corridor like a door slamming. Panels rolled into place. Doors that had been designed for emergency sealing descended like the edge of a tomb. In a lesser moment, you might have thought the seals a relief, but with the way the corridor tasted, metallic with a hint of something like ozone, you knew the locks were closing for containment rather than safety. On the console, the meter for the eastern ring began to spike. The needles climbed and fell like someone throttling a trembling engine. Miguel tapped a patch cable into a junction box and cursed. The radio came alive with a different voice, someone at the relay trying to report structural stress. Their words came in breathless bursts. "Tiles in sublevel 9 detached. Airflow compromised. We have motion not on roster." "Not on roster," Javier repeated. The phrase was small, but it landed like a stone. We heard a dull, reverberant sound then, far enough away that we could have told ourselves it was the building itself settling.
But then something on the other side of the reinforced door answered it. Metal on metal, a tearing that sounded like fabric being ripped. The reinforced glass on Subject 3's tank vibrated, and a hairline crack spidered across its surface like frost. The lab techs looked at each other with faces gone pale. They had studied contingency plans for years, but plans can be brittle. "Initiate containment protocol beta," one of them said with a voice that did not fit his trembling hands. It sounded like an order read from a card worn thin by repetition. They began to prepare transfer carts, to mount straps, to ready sedatives that were approved for nervous animals, not for whatever looked back at us through the glass. They moved with competence. The gurneys were wheeled out, the carts clanked. Dr. Moreno barked directives with a practiced cadence that had stopped shy of panic because he had been trained to keep his own fear in reserve.
Cortez and the colonel consulted in low voices. Outside, someone was calling for structural reinforcement. Inside, we were strapped to a protocol that suddenly seemed to have been written for another set of assumptions. It was then I noticed the gestures. The big specimen, bigger than the tanks, a shape half obscured in a ringed observation room, began to make movements that were distinct from flailing. Its limbs extended and it pressed, as if feeling the glass with the tips of fingers. It made a motion that might have been a point or a reach, one long, slow extension of an arm that ended in something like an open palm pressed to the inside of the observation port. The palm spread in a way that suggested exploration, or perhaps communication. I had seen soldiers touch artillery, engines, the things men use to kill or fix. A hand on a machine is different than a hand on a wall before a crowd. This was neither machine nor crowd. The gesture carried an uneasy resemblance to a plea. Dr. Moreno swallowed, and for a moment the scientist dropped his professional mask. "They show deliberate behaviors," he said. "They're responding to stimuli." His voice cracked a fraction. For a man whose life was made of measures and margins, the emergent variable, and intelligence that wasn't neatly categorized, was a disruptive force. An alarm tone shifted then, a layered sound that seemed to climb in pitch and intensity. The lights cut out to a dim red that turned everything into shadows. The intercom system failed with a final pop that left a vacuum where human instruction should be. Our own radios, which had been unreliable in the tunnel, now threw static like a snowfield. Miguel tried to patch a carrier. The signal collapsed into white noise. There was a sound like a vessel scraping against the inside of a tube, steady, grinding, and then a sound with no good comparison, like someone stretching a metal drum beyond its normal stress until it sang a high note, then broke.
The reinforced glass in Subject 7's tank fractured with a series of small cracks rather than one dramatic blow. The water pushed out in a slow, obscene bloom. The creature inside did not explode into fury. It moved with a studied, efficient violence that made the air itself feel unsteady. Someone shouted to get back, shouts that started perfectly in protocol and then descended into the rawness of people who don't have rehearsed plans for this. Javier snapped into action. His training took over like a second skin. The stock of his 1911 rose, the muzzle steady. Miguel cursed, trying frantically to get a transmission out to the surface. Dr. Moreno grabbed a tray of sedatives and flung himself at the tank, but the fluid sloshed and the creature was against the glass like a thing that had learned where friction might be weakest. We were not soldiers of a battlefield where the enemy wore uniforms and carried flags. We were a team of men who had been given a map and a set of rules and told to enforce them. Now the universe had slipped some of its rules. The first physical breach in the corridor was small, a vent cover torn free, a sluice ripped, the kind of thing you might not notice but for the sudden rush of air and wet. The ventilation system engaged in a way it was never meant to do when a containment volume loses equilibrium. Doors that had been designed to resist failed because the system that balanced them had been compromised. A low panic began to thread human voices. Evacuate, contain, shut it down, but the intercom gave only spasms of static. In that chaos, the larger specimen, whatever its origin, made a motion toward a maintenance hatch. It moved with precision. I felt the precise cut of fear, the awareness that what you faced understood the map of the place better than the men defending it. "Get the charges," someone yelled. When you work in secretive places, the word charges has the same two-syllable clarity as antidote. It is an option that ends arguments. Cortez looked at the colonel as if seeking confirmation of a bad arithmetic. The colonel's jaw worked. He is a man who had been trained to carry the logic of institution above the weight of the thing itself. But the weight on his face was something else, hesitation laced with a grim realism. "We may not have time," he said. The word was a verdict. Those standing near the wall traded glances that could not be reconciled with the neatness of their prior models. Something slammed against the glass of an observation port with a force that made the whole corridor vibrate. The sound traveled inside me like a warning. There were no cries of simple rage, not at first, not the animal screams that quickened blood. There was a sort of focused noise, as if a being had learned that pounding on barriers made certain patterns occur in the response. The lab tech nearest the portable console had his hands all over the buttons, trying to get the system to respond, trying to reroute power, shouting numbers as if numbers could keep doors closed. Miguel found a weak carrier through a patch point. His voice came through on a thin line. "This is Ramirez team," he said. "Sub-levels compromised. Request immediate support." Static swallowed the rest. The line disappeared like the tail of a comet. For an instant, we were all reminded of the relative frailty of communication, that our words travel on copper and air and are as likely to die as to be heard. I remember the heat then.
It arrived not from fire, but from the friction of compressed air, from the machinery working at unnatural loads. The corridor's lights flickered, and a hum began to rise that matched the frequency of the alarm, a kind of mechanical scream that harmonized with the building's bones. Subject 3's tank bled its fluid onto the floor through a hairline crack that widened into a wound. The creature, whatever name you want to give it, pressed itself into the leak like one clumsy limb seeking purchase. The lab technicians moved like fishermen trying to net a thing that did not belong to their nets. And from somewhere deeper, from a set of tunnels we had only seen on paper, a sound came that made hair stand. It might have been metal tearing, or the thud of large limbs on concrete. It might have been both. Javier moved. He barked orders with a voice that was now entirely his training. Back to the elevator. Get everyone out. He didn't look at the colonel for permission. There was no time. We ran. The corridor contracted into the elevator shaft, and the air felt as if someone had squeezed the bottom of a balloon. People moved with purpose. The elevator began its climb as if some invisible hand was giving it mercy. We left the lab doors and their broken glass behind us, the smell of chemical and refrigeration and something else that clung to my clothes like a rumor. As the elevator hissed upward, I looked back through the hatch at the corridor's mouth and saw through the red emergency lights and the steam a shadow moving in the upper tunnel. It stopped and seemed to make a motion that I couldn't place. Not an attack, not a wave, but something closer to recognition. It looked at the elevator and its windows as if studying a foreign animal. We reached the first level and spilled out into the administrative area. People were shouting, tears mixing with the antiseptic sheen beneath fluorescent bulbs. Colonel Hayes was on the phone, speaking to someone with a voice that had returned to the careful detachment of the man who could send men away. "We have a breach," he said into the handset. "We require immediate containment and authorization for demolition if necessary." When the words demolition are tossed into a room of people who are trained to safeguard life, something splits. Dr. Moreno and Cortez argued in short, choked sentences.
One mentioned ethical frameworks, consent, the long-term implications of their research. The other kept time with institutional survival. A decision could not wait for arguments about ethics when what you were doing might bear the cost of unknown variables. I will remember the colonel's face as he made the call, the way his fingers tightened into fists on the receiver like he was bracing for the blow. He had the look of a man who has weighed possibilities on the scale and comes down in favor of the institution because the institution pays him and deploys him and might punish him if he disrupted it. Outside, the sky was the indifferent gray of late summer storms that have yet to decide whether to rain. I stood with Miguel and Javier near the gate as a convoy of site security men scrambled to block the perimeter. The radio at the gate crackled with voices that carried the professional numbness of men who have seen worse and learned to compress it into small, precise actions. "Seal east access," someone said. "No civilians in or out. Wait for orders." I thought of Subject 7 in its tank, the way it had looked at me. I thought of the way intelligence had slid into that creature's eyes, like a light turning on. You do not see that without being changed. You return from a thing like that, and your map of the world is altered at the edges. We were ordered to stay. The colonel said it was to write statements, to give a full account. He told us to avoid telling anyone our story, in the way soldiers are often told to avoid telling stories, not as censorship, but as an operational necessity. Miguel wanted to scrape forensic readings from the computers. Javier wanted names and numbers for the men who died, if any died. I wanted, uselessly, to go back down to the tank and see if that face was still there, to see if I could find a way to say sorry across a barrier. But we were ordered to wait, and wait we did. We gave our signatures on forms that looked like they had been designed to be unreadable after a certain point. We were given coffee that tasted like tiredness. Nobody did anything dramatic. The presence of the weapon at our side felt like a sad joke. No enemy in uniform, but a threat all the same. Then a convoy in a heavy gray truck trundled into the lot, and men in uniform stood behind it. Other soldiers who arrived not as repair, but as something else. Their patches were obscured, their faces set. They wore the kind of blankness that arrives with a message from above. A black sedan with no plates took up a place near the perimeter. Men in plain suits disembarked and walked inside like ghosts in tailored coats. The suits and the soldiers spoke in low voices. The suits smoked cigarettes like old men mourning. We were told to stay within a set of lines taped onto the concrete and not to cross them. We were also told to keep the forms of our words tidy. We had an equipment fault, one of the men in the suits murmured, as if repeating a script to tourists.
Structural failure in an old section. It triggered internal alarms. The event is contained. If you have been a man who has spent time answering the truth in private, you learn the texture of lies that are generous to institutions. They framed the day as an accident. They woke the shells of the building.
They marshaled a language of repair, and then they sent us off to sign more papers and go home. I went home. I signed a non-disclosure agreement while a man in a dark suit watched me initial each paragraph with a pen that had left stains on his fingers. They gave each of us a modest gratuity and a reassignment notice with a time and place and a new supervisor's badge. I tried to make sense of it by measuring my own small acts, the way I'd looked at Subject 7, the gesture of the larger specimen at the observation window, the crackle of radios that had failed to carry messages when we needed them. It is one thing to be told the official line. It is another to carry the memory of a moment that does not fit that line. In the weeks after, I found the memory bleeding into strange places. I would be at a diner and catch myself staring at the reflection in a glass of water and thinking of eyes behind rippling fluid. I would wake with the taste of metal in my mouth. I would imagine the gesture of a palm pressed to a window and find myself offering a halting wave to people I passed in the street, as if the gesture might be returned. But even then, in the first nights back at home, there was a practical side to my thinking. I catalogued the anomalies I had seen, the telemetry drop at 0300, the failure of external synchronization, the targeted movement of specimens, the breach of containment, the arrival of men in suits. I kept the details like a man keeps a bunker of memories, one stacked crate at a time, in case I needed them. What I did not know then, what I could not have known until later, was how deep the fissures would run. The official report that landed in my mailbox was a neat thing, one of those clever absurdities the bureaucracy creates to make chaos look tidy. The document concluded that a structural failure had triggered a local emergency and that the facility had taken appropriate steps to secure sensitive materials. No mention of the tanks, no acknowledgement of the look of thought in an unnameable creature's face. The signatures on the report were clean and stamped and belonged to men whose careers depended on forgetting. I kept my badge from that night in a drawer under a stack of old rations. Sometimes I would open the drawer and look at it, like a man viewing a coin he had found in a river, evidence of something that had once been real. I would remember the way Subject 7 had studied the laboratory instruments, and the way the larger form had made that unmistakable motion at the observation port. I would remember the way our radios were swallowed, and the way the alarm had shifted from a tone to a human moan. Weeks turned to months.
The site on the ridge returned to silence on the maps, a smudge that meant no trespassing. Men came and went in gray trucks. The locals told rumors that the place was an old mine, then corrected themselves with the kind of embarrassed shrug people give when they have told a story to visitors. The mountain kept its hollow, like a secret in its bones. But every once in a while, my sleep would be cut into pieces by the memory of that face at the glass. I would think about how we chose to categorize living things, because it made them manageable. The facility had not only contained the specimens, it had contained the moral questions. We trained to obey orders. We were rewarded for compliance. And then, when events asked for an ethical impulse, we were given forms to sign. One night, lying awake and listening to the house's pipes, I could not shake the sense that we had been given a script that allowed men to play God so long as they labeled it a necessary option. The question of whether it had been necessary, whether the measured destruction that was hinted at in the colonel's voice was the same thing as mercy, or simply expedience, sank like a stone in my stomach. I was not alone in thinking that. Later, in the company of other soldiers scattered to other posts, I would hear the same thread in different voices, claimed oddities that had been smoothed into neutral bureaucratic prose. Men who had been on site, and men who had only been told what to say, found that certain memories did not wash away. You can sign a paper and step away, but you cannot always make your hands forget a pressure curve, a broken pane, the human shape of a plea. That was where I left it for a while, with the form signed, with the official line clean, with the mountains smoothed into the maps and the memory folded quietly away. But memories have a way of asserting themselves like roots. They find dry places to begin again and push. I did not know then that the signal failure on the ridge would be the trigger for a series of events that would ripple through the men who were there. I did not know that the choices made in corridors with red lights and analog dials would follow us like ghosts. I did not know that the thing behind the glass had looked for a language in our faces. I only knew the weight of the badge in the drawer, the flatness of the report, and the way the image of a hand pressed to an observation port would wake me in the dark, and make me an accomplice. After the signatures and the suits and the reassignment notices, life did the thing it does best. It moved forward and tried to look like progress, but the movement was a shallow kind, surface-level rhythms that hit a current I couldn't stop thinking about. Miguel took a posting farther north handling relay maintenance. His hands never stopped twitching in the way a man who'd held fragile circuitry does when he tries to sleep.
Javier was rotated into a training squad. He arrived at his new station with a face I didn't recognize for months, the sort of tightness time treats as patriotism until the cost becomes visible. David kept driving. He'd always been good at keeping distance. That job suited him. We all learned, quickly and without ceremony, the art of appearing to recover. That first winter, the dreams arrived in layers. I would be back on the ridge, but the concrete would be soft as bread, and water would slosh from the tanks in slow time, while a red light thinned a corridor into something like a needle. Sometimes I'd dream I could hear the relays cry, a choked carrier signal, half noise and half voice, repeating a phrase I had never learned. I would wake with the taste of antiseptic in my mouth, and a small, ridiculous feeling of guilt, as if by not understanding I had betrayed a question the mountain had asked. Men told me later that memory is a traitor because it remembers texture better than chronology. It remembers how your boot felt on a stair rather than what day it was. I could name the pattern of condensation on the glass. I could tell you the way Subject 7 turned its head when I shifted my weight. I could not, with the same confidence, explain why we had been there at all, beyond the simple order stamped on the slip of paper. Orders arrive with a kind of authority that makes you obey on faith. That faith keeps you from asking whether what you obeyed was moral. You tell yourself you were doing your duty. Duty can be a shelter or a sentence. Newsprint that winter said nothing. The local papers had a sentence about a facility emergency and a note that structural repairs were underway. An AP wire might have mentioned temporary suspension of non-essential operations, and that was the end of it. Official channels prefer tidy nouns. They prefer phrases that can be printed without making the reader uncomfortable for too long. If you are a system, you cannot afford to accommodate too many messy facts. I tried to get more than those tidy nouns. I filed what I thought were reasonable requests for copies of logs, for photographs of the area before the event, for any maintenance records referring to a telemetry outage in the summer of 1974. The paper trail I found was a study in absence, redactions, pages missing, a polite note saying the material was classified under directive, followed by a paragraph of Latin-like bureaucratic jargon. The more I pushed, the thicker the wall of paperwork became. There was a loneliness to battling forms. The forms don't argue with you. They simply deny you. A year later, I found Miguel at a diner off an interstate exit. He looked older than his age, lines at his mouth, a kind of consolidated exhaustion in his eyes. He had a thermos of coffee and a pack of cigarettes that he didn't finish. For a while we traded the day's smallness, weather, a gripe about a sergeant, until the diner thinned and our talk found permission.
"You see anything else?" I asked him, more curious than I cared to admit. Miguel shook his head. "Some of the tapes I had on my bench, they were gone when I came back. The logbooks had pages burned out, like someone took a lighter to the right sections." He tapped his table. "They paid me overtime and then moved me, filed a temporary reassignment. There was a chap in plain clothes who asked about a particular schematic. I told him it was obsolete. I lied. I knew the schematic." "What did they tell you to say?" I asked. "Structural failure," he said. They kept saying it until I could taste it. He looked at me, then away. "Now I keep wires at my house I don't touch. I sleep, and sometimes a circuit in my head hums when it shouldn't." We didn't talk about the look the creature gave me. It felt like a confession I was not ready to make. But Miguel, who had spent nights soldering until his fingers were sore, understood the nature of listening. He reached into his jacket and pulled a folded cigarette pack from the inside pocket, as if the gesture could steady the conversation enough to bear the truths we hadn't yet named. Not all the men took it quietly. A technician who had been on site refused to sign the final statement and was moved to a different command. Another, a young lab assistant who had literally been a boy the month before, ended up at a VA clinic with a diagnosis they printed on a form and handed to him like a consolation. Acute stress reaction, put them on a quiet schedule, send them back to work. The human costs were recorded in a way that allowed institutions to continue operating. Fine ink and neat signatures are excellent bandages for practical things. They don't stitch the soul. I left the service within 2 years. I requested a discharge that had the right code to make my exit quiet. It was not a dramatic leaving. There were no protests, no plaudits, just the slow removing of a uniform that had fit me only by convention. The paperwork said my separation was for personal reasons. The reason you choose does not always translate to the paper. Outside the uniform, I learned to wear skepticism like a coat. Men who have seen certain things become good at noticing small inconsistencies. A maintenance crew who leaves a vehicle running near a gate long after the shift, a truck with plates that never quite match the issuing state's font, a fresh patch in a forest where no road ought to be. Once you notice the seams in a thing, they never quite stop showing. I tried, not as heroism, but as habit, to find the place again. The ridge had been catalogued as closed to public access. Fences were put up, then more fences, then signs carved into metal. I drove by once on a Sunday afternoon a year after the event, hands on the wheel, heart thudding with a childish hope I did not trust.
A man in plain clothes watched me from the gate and gave nothing with a gesture but a face that said, in the shorthand we had all learned, "You shouldn't be here." I turned the truck around because a polite instinct is sometimes a matter of survival. I drove away and felt like the man who had been asked to forget the name of someone he loved. Years passed. I married, briefly, and the marriage did not survive the quiet that had moved into me. I quit jobs when the memory got too loud for the office fluorescent lights. Sometimes at night I'd tune an old tabletop radio, the kind that had dials and a thin, satisfying resistance when you moved them, and I'd listen through static. On certain nights, especially when a storm stained the lines of the air, I'd swear I could hear an almost language at the edge of the carrier, no more than a hitch, a modulation that didn't belong there. I would tell myself it was old wiring or the ghost of the mountain. That was how I comforted myself, by making a reasonable cause fit the unreasonable memory. Then, 12 years after the event, I received a letter in a cheap manila envelope, no return address, inside a single sheet of lined paper with a hurried script. The note said simply, "You remember the hand. Don't trust the erasure." It was unsigned. I folded the paper and kept it in a drawer with the badge. There are ways that institutions try to erase not only objects but also memory. They issue orders, they misdirect inquiries, they tar with social indifference, they grant pensions and quiet jobs and the promise of non-questions. These are practical erasures. They smooth the edges of a scandal into a word like incident, so that the word becomes a rumor, and rumors fade. But memory is stubborn. People who were there tended to find each other. It's hard to hang a shroud over what you have seen if you meet other witnesses whose recollections stitch neatly with yours. I met a woman once in a bookshop who recognized me from a photograph that had circulated years later in a print magazine, a long-form piece on oddities that had been careful to couch everything in distance. She was not looking for sensationalism. She was looking for answers. She told me she had grown up down the lane from the ridge and had strange childhood memories of lights that were too fast to be headlights, of men in vans who always got out and walked like they were carrying bales of something heavy. Her voice was calm. Her eyes were sharp. "There are more of us than you think," she said. "Not all of us are willing to sign a quiet life." That sentence lodged in me. It makes you see the contours of complicity in ways your uniform never will. The secrecy around such projects is a communal action. It requires silence from bystanders, obedience from subordinates, and the cooperation of men with suits. It also needs the public's boredom. Keep them replaying the same sports clip or the same political drama, and they'll let the other things slide.
I am not immune to the temptation to think of ourselves as the only witnesses, but the truth of things like this is often that memory is threaded through many lives in different forms. A retired miner in a nearby town who had seen the mountain for 50 years told a reporter years later that they had dynamited a part of the ridge in the late 70s for a road that never appeared. The reporter filed the comment with a shrug, and the paper ran it as a local oddity. The local oddity made me scratch my head. There were rumors, too, always rumors, about a controlled demolition to seal sections of the hill. Men whispered about charges set to collapse the sublevels, about an earth-moving crew that buried an access shaft and then quietly seeded the site with new growth. Years later, a farmer claimed he'd seen heavy equipment in the dead of night, moving like skeletons in the moonlight. None of these claims were proof. They were fragments, as reliable as human memory can be, partial, messy, flavored by time. Sometimes the moral question becomes conducted through the small, private theater of regret. In the dark, I would imagine the alternatives. If we'd paused, if we'd insisted on humane measures, if we had found a way to communicate with whatever looked back at us. You can invent your own possibilities as a private salve. The mind is generous enough to provide an infinite number of what-ifs. But the real moral work is not to indulge hypotheticals. It's to ask what was within our power, then and now. There was another time, a long while after, when I ran into Dr. Moreno at a veterans memorial. He looked older in a way that conversation does not flatter.
Loss had carved the angles of his face. He did not look surprised to see me, only tired. We spoke, at first, of innocuous things: children, weather, the awkwardness of retirement. Finally, the conversation folded inward like a hinge. "I thought about writing," he said quietly, an admission that softened his voice. "About the ethics papers, about consent. But the people who fund work have gravity." He shrugged as if gravity were both metaphor and a physical law that had smudged the page of conscience. "We convinced ourselves the containment served a higher good. That was our justification." "What did you feel then?" I asked. That was the question I had carried for many years. "I felt the wrongness of our right," he answered. "We had made a room for life that we never asked to enter. Knowing that feels like complicity. Knowing doesn't absolve you." I told him, for the first time, about the way the large creature had pressed its palm to the observation port. He listened without surprise, the way someone who has cataloged anomalies does. "They learn fast," he said, "but learning isn't consent." The language of consent, so simple in our private lives and so difficult in institutional contexts, became the tether that tied my shame.
If the thing behind the glass had any claim to personhood, our procedures had nothing within them to reckon with that claim. We had been handed the opportunity to ask the hard question and had chosen containment and categorization because they were administratively manageable. Years later, at night, I would imagine different outcomes. Sometimes I pictured the men in suits carrying specimens out in crates like moving furniture, silent, locked, pragmatic. Other times I imagined a collapse that buried too much, that made it impossible to tell what had happened beneath the rock. Both pictures lead to the same moral question. When you intersect with the unknown, do you default to force because it is a language you know? There are behaviors that become habitual when institutions face things they do not understand. First, minimize. Second, sanitize the narrative. Third, move assets out of sight. These steps are simple and practiced. They are not necessarily evil. Sometimes secrecy saves lives, but secrecy is also a blunt instrument that sees fewer things than we might like. That is the moral lesson that unnerves me, that in service to safety, we may sacrifice integrity. In my later years, I would sometimes return to the ridge in the guise of nothing more than a man taking a drive. The gate had been altered, mended, repainted, made to look ordinary in a way the mountain refused to be. Once I saw a tree planted near the access road, with a young growth ring at its base, as if someone had tried to speed the mountain's forgetting by giving it new life. A landscape gardener does good work for a cover story. The one thing that troubled me more than the physical alterations was the signal. Not all signals are radio waves. Some are habits, patterns, the way wind moves through a gap. But there was a night once, in late autumn, when the air had that thin bite you get before hard frost, and I sat in my truck with an old handheld radio on my knee. The frequency was one I had used in training, a simplex band with a handful of channels we used for convoy checks. Static shivered through the speaker, and then settled into a cadence that did not belong to thunder or cicadas, a low carrier with a slight wobble, like a voice trying to remember which language to use. I held the mic to my mouth and said something stupid, my name, the year, because it felt obscene not to speak. The radio hummed back nothing I could parse, only a flutter, faint and persistent, like the memory of a carrier trying to come back to life. I cannot prove the carrier was connected to what we saw. Maybe it was atmospheric ducting, or some farmer's malfunctioning equipment, or the effect of a storm on old wiring. That is the careful truth. It is also the honest one. In a world where institutions control access to facts, your best weapon is a careful account that resists making false claims. I learned to be precise because precision is the difference between being dismissed and being listened to.
In the end, the thing I have carried more than anything else is the ethical residue. When you spend a night in a place that looks like a lab and ends like a courtroom, you understand how much moral labor is needed to hold the line between curiosity and cruelty. We had instruments for measuring oxygenation and pH. We had men with clipboards who could make a life look like a data set. But we lacked the forms for asking whether a living thing had a claim to the same sorts of dignities we afford ourselves. People sometimes ask me what I would have done differently if I had the chance to go back. I do not live in the delightful fantasy of omniscience. I know what I would have tried: slower moves, insistence on non-lethal containment, a moratorium until ethicists and a broader team could convene. Those are the things a conscience suggests. Whether I would have been listened to is another matter. The machinery of command is not designed to stop for good questions that cost time and money. I am not telling this as proof of anything beyond what I know. I was there, I saw certain things, I signed certain forms, and I have remembered. The rest is elision and rumor and the kinds of shadows bureaucracies throw. If the story ends with the mountains smoothed and a set of men dispersed into lives that looked ordinary, that is true enough. If the story ends with a rumor of a light that sometimes outruns a headlight on a foggy night, that is true too. Both truths can be true at once, because human life is layered like that. As this world turned toward new conflicts and new technologies, the mountain remained stubborn. New maps arrived with new labels. Men who had been in our unit died of unrelated things: heart attacks, cancer, the slow erosion of a life unmade by stress. Their names are in my memory like bright marks that don't blot out the larger shapes: the hand on the glass, the way the alarm shifted into a human sound. Memory is stubbornly particular, and it will not let me simplify the event into a neat moral lesson. So here is what I ask of anyone who hears this account. Ask better questions. When an institution asks you to accept an explanation that feels tidy, ask who benefits from its tidiness. When secrecy cloaks an action, ask who paid for the secrecy and whether the price was worth the claim of safety. Do not accept an erasure just because it has the right signatures. If you see a hand pressed to a window, consider whose voice that hand might be trying to make. I do not offer answers. I offer testimony, which is a different thing altogether. Testimony is the insistence that someone else might have been there too, and that memory deserves a place at the table. If you have patience with ambiguity, and I hope you do, then you will understand why I tell this in the present voice sometimes, why I insist on the details that awaken the senses. Those details are what grounds the testimony in human life. The years have not given me the comfort of certainty.
They have offered instead a larger sympathy for the limits of modern power and the moral cost of its exercise. We were told we acted for national security. Perhaps we did. I do not know whether the calculus was right. What I do know is that whatever was down there looked at us in a way that asked to be understood, and that we chose a form of containment over a form of conversation. That choice has followed me like an afterimage. If you are the kind of person who wants to know more, there are threads to pick at. People who were there are scattered but sometimes talk in the margins. Local newspapers have small items that only make more sense in the context of a larger narrative. And occasionally, if you sit with a long radio on a storm night, you might hear a carrier trying to remember what language it prefers. None of that is proof. It is simply part of the texture. I tell this story because memory deserves to be heard, and because secrecy is easiest where silence is cheapest. If this account reaches anyone who was there, or anyone who remembers a rumor, or anyone who thinks they have a scrap of detail that might stitch to another, speak. Not for law enforcement or for headlines, but for the moral economy of remembering. We do not owe institutions our blind obedience. We owe truth to the people who cannot speak for themselves. If this story gripped you and you want to hear other first-person accounts like it, watch the next video in this series and leave your thoughts below.